Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is John Paul Jones, and I'm the Don Bennett Moon Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. I would formally like to recognize Mr. Moon tonight, sitting here in the front row, not only for his personal friendship, but also his lasting gift to me and to future deans of the College of SBS. And also for suggesting and underwriting tonight's conversation on free speech. The topic is his great passion for Don, former county attorney and prosecutor and lawyer and activist on free speech and privacy. For him, the First Amendment is the first among all the amendments. In addition to his foundation, tonight's event is sponsored by UA's Agnes Nelms Haury Program in Environment and Social Justice. Mrs. Haury would certainly have been approving of tonight's gathering. She had a keen intellect and was herself committed to free and open debate. I'm pleased to recognize Haury trustee Mary Greer, who is with us here tonight. In addition, I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Freedom of the Press Foundation and the UA Dean of Students Office. Thank you, Dean Kendall Washington White and Associate Dean Kathy Adams Reister. Congratulations. And not last, I'm indebted to the fantastic work of the SBS staff in development and tech, marketing and communications, and community engagement for all their work in putting this event together. The topic of free speech on campus has received renewed attention in recent years due to the hostile reception and occasional disinvitations of controversial speakers on college campuses. Tonight's panelists will discuss the boundaries of free speech, both on and off campus, and in the process, address the tensions between adhering to the legal guidelines of free speech and promoting a non-hostile campus learning environment. The topic is more timely than ever in Arizona, where in April of this year, our governor signed HB 2563, which directs the 3 state institutions and community colleges to create free expression policies that, quote, ensure the fullest degree of intellectual freedom. With tonight's discussion, the University of Arizona demonstrates early leadership on the thoughtful discussions necessary to implement this directive. And tonight's panelists include some of the most prominent voices in the country on the topic of free speech. Sigal Ben-Porath is a professor of education, political science, and philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, where she also chairs the university's Committee on Open Expression. Her most recent book is titled Free Speech on Campus. In it, she offers strategies to de-escalate tensions and negotiate debates surrounding trigger warnings, safe spaces, and speech that verges on hate. Her nuanced approach is called Inclusive Freedom, which aims to protect free speech while taking into account the necessity of making sure that all are included in the ensuing conversation. The book includes a discussion and analysis of the many recent and well-publicized instances of free speech controversies on U.S. campuses, and it should be of particular interest to faculty, administrators, and student groups assembled here tonight. Nadine Strossen was the first woman and youngest president of the American Civil Liberties Union, which she led from 1991 to 2008. She is currently the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of New York at New York Law School, a frequent speaker on constitutional and civil liberties issues. Her media appearances include 60 Minutes, Today, Good Morning America, and The Daily Show. She has been speaking and writing about free speech since the 1977 court decision involving Skokie, Illinois. Her 2018 book, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censoring, is an in-depth analysis of prohibitions against hate speech, with many international examples that provide contrast to U.S. law. She argues, quote, that the very concept of hate speech is irreducibly riddled with ambiguity, conflicts, and confusion, and concludes, quote, that benefits will come to flow from increasingly vigorous, sophisticated counterspeech and other non-censorial countermeasures, such as education. Noam Chomsky, laureate professor of linguistics and the Agnes Nelms Haury Chair, is an uncompromising free speech advocate, a stance that has often outraged presumptive allies on the left and subjected him to both personal and professional risk. Chomsky's view is encapsulated by his claim that, quote, if we don't believe in freedom of expression for people we despise, we don't believe in it at all. The founder of modern linguistics, whose contributions have influenced many fields, from computer science and psychology to mathematics, Noam Chomsky is one of the most cited scholars in history, and we are proud that he has chosen the University of Arizona as his academic home. Tonight's panel will be moderated by famed First Amendment attorney Bob Corn-Revere, a partner at the law firm Davis Wright Tremaine. Corn-Revere specializes in freedom of expression and communications law and is the president of the First Amendment Lawyers Association and an adjunct professor at the Cato Institute. He represents students and faculty members as lead counsel for the Stand Up for Free Speech litigation project of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. In numerous cases, he has successfully represented university students battling censorship on campus, including the unconstitutional enforcement of free speech zones. I might add, as a historical footnote, that in 1967, former Congressman Ron Barber, at the time a student at the U of A and president of the Young Democrats, pressured the director of the student union to provide a free speech zone on campus so that the group could protest the Vietnam War. Such zones were made illegal in 2016 on Arizona campuses. So now, free speech is permitted everywhere. Bob will open the panel with a brief overview of the campus issues, but before that commences, I have asked Trevor Timm, co-founder and the executive director of the Freedom of the Press Association Foundation, to provide some context for our discussion, specifically regarding the First Amendment from the viewpoint of a self-described millennial. Timm is a journalist, activist, and lawyer who writes regularly for The Intercept, as well as The New York Times, The Guardian, and The Atlantic. His 2016 TED Talk explaining how the First Amendment is, quote, the safety valve of our democracy, has over 1.4 million views, and his 60,000-strong Twitter feed is a leading social media forum on current threats to privacy, free speech, and an independent press. Please join me in welcoming and thanking the panelists for joining us here tonight.
Good evening. Thanks so much to Dean Jones, to University of Arizona, and the Don Moon Foundation for putting on this wonderful and very timely event. So as everybody knows, the First Amendment is sort of having a moment. The rights to free speech, to protest, to gather news have never been so important, yet at the same time, at least we're led to believe they've never been more controversial. In fact, the phrase free speech itself seems to have a negative connotation for a lot of people, as white nationalists and right-wing agitators have attempted to hide their repellent ideology by claiming that their movement is really just about free speech. Yet at the same time, the First Amendment remains a critical tool, especially for those fighting against white nationalists and for social justice and progressive values. It protects the press when it publishes information leaked from the Trump White House. It protects protesters from prosecution, even when they're in the vicinity of violence. It protects human rights advocates when they post information for how immigrants can stay safe from ICE or Trump's deportation force. It protects students everywhere who advocate for the divestment from Israel, which several schools and several politicians have attempted to ban. It even protects Twitter users who generally advocate for, quote, punching Nazis. From the perspective of First Amendment advocates, the benefits are clear. But at the same time, us First Amendment advocates have a duty. We need to understand the point of view of many students who may be wary of First Amendment law, and why students may not fully buy into the right to allow abhorrent speech actually protects them rather than hurts them. After all, for a long time, the most widely cited justification for America's broad free speech protections was that the best arguments will win out in the, quote, marketplace of ideas. But you could forgive anybody from this generation who have seen their job prospects evaporate in front of them because of the financial collapse for not exactly putting their faith in anything resembling a marketplace. Contrary to what has been repeated ad nauseum in, for example, the New York Times op-ed page, I don't actually believe that college students or the under 40 generation or millennials, as everybody derisively likes to call them, are universally hostile to free speech. I myself am a millennial, and so even I get offended by that. After all, campuses are just as likely, or as a recent FIRE study showed, even more likely to censor left-wing speech. It's true that some polls have shown that college students are a bit more hostile to free speech than baby boomers, but others have shown they're more tolerant. It really depends on how you phrase the question. And there's also reasons to be hopeful. Young people and college students are incredibly passionate about civil rights and racial justice issues, speaking out far more than a generation that came before it. When I was in high school, just 15 years ago, all the older generation complained about back then was how young people didn't care about anything anymore, and that everyone was apathetic. Now the complaint seems to be that young people care too much. I think what this debate needs is a lot less complaining about kids these days, and more about how the First Amendment actually protects you in practice. First Amendment advocates do not defend abhorrent or disgusting speech because they wish to protect racists and misogynists just so that they have a platform. In fact, part of their goal is just the opposite. They do so to protect those protesting against those same people. The same government justifications that are used to shut down a white nationalist rally, like public safety or vague threats of violence, are the same justifications conservative governments have used to shut down Occupy Wall Street protests after the financial crisis, or Black Lives Matter protests today. All you have to do is read the news to see how rules restricting speech can actually backfire on those that they're supposed to protect the most. So we need to think more about the young people of color who have actually recently been banned from Facebook or had their accounts suspended under Facebook's hate speech rules for actually calling out or documenting hate speech so more people can hear about it. Or the war crimes prosecutors who are furious with YouTube and Google for deleting videos under their new anti-promotion of violence policy, which they had planned to use as evidence in war crimes trials in Syria. Or all of the real news organizations who have seen their online traffic fall off a cliff because of Facebook's push to eliminate fake news. But we want to hear all sides of this debate tonight. All of the many benefits, but also all of the trade-offs when it comes to robust free speech rights. There are so many things on this topic that we can discuss, and I don't want to take up too much time. We are incredibly lucky to have such a distinguished panel tonight. It's no exaggeration to say that our panelists are some of the most important free speech speakers and scholars on the First Amendment in the last half century. So with that, I will turn it over to our distinguished moderator, who he himself has had a direct hand in many of the most important free speech legal cases in the last 30 years. So please join me in welcoming Bob Corn-Revere.
Thanks, Trevor. Thanks, JP, for inviting me, and Don for sponsoring this. Thank all of you for coming. Hope to have a very impassioned dialogue here tonight. As Trevor mentioned, I am a practicing lawyer. That's why I thought it was important to come in costume tonight. Also, I understand it's a university crowd, so you may not have seen a suit before. So this is what they look like. Anyway, as a working lawyer, I'm sort of more like the mechanic on this crew. I sort of use the principles of First Amendment in my job day to day, but the real thinkers, the theoreticians, the people who are developing First Amendment theory and giving it deep thought are the ones that we're going to hear from tonight. And so what I'm going to try and do in the first few minutes is try and talk about how we got to this stage in the development of First Amendment law and how that pertains to the issues that are currently happening on campus. And so we start with the words of the First Amendment. And I'm getting my microphone in place. As Trevor mentioned, there is some concern about people who just invoke free speech, particularly for younger people who just hear about this as protecting Nazis and so on. It's like saying, why is this protected? And someone says, well, the First Amendment requires it. It's kind of like asking a theologian a question, and they say, well, because God said so. And so it's important to understand how we got to this stage of development. These 45 words guarantee 5 basic American freedoms: freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of petition. Actually, it also protects freedom from religion, so really it's 6. But the text of the First Amendment really doesn't tell you anything about the content of those amendments and what they really mean. It's important to recognize that the First Amendment was not interpreted by the Supreme Court for the first 140 years of the Republic. And when it did get around to doing so, it did so on a case-by-case basis, tailored to the situation presented by those particular cases. So the first case came in 1931, in a case called Stromberg versus California, where a 19-year-old, Yetta Stromberg, who was the counselor at a summer youth communist camp, was arrested and convicted under a California law that made it a felony to fly a red flag in opposition to organized government. It was the first time, when it reached the Supreme Court, that court held in favor of a First Amendment claim, holding that this violates rather basic rights of freedom of expression. Now, after the Stromberg case, a number of other decisions of the 20th century began to flesh out and define what those 45 words of the First Amendment means, or the 14 words if you're talking about just protections for freedom of speech and freedom of press. Courts didn't get around to intellectual freedom cases until some time later. So in 1940, in one of the first decisions in this area, a court in New York upheld the dismissal of famed philosopher Bertrand Russell from the City College of New York, basically for being an atheist, but also for, as the court described it, for teaching immoral and salacious doctrines in his books, for holding abhorrently repulsive ideas on nudity and masturbation, meaning he wasn't against them. He held tolerant views toward what the court described as the damnable felony of homosexualism, and also said that academic freedom doesn't protect this because academic freedom really only protects what is good and does not protect the freedom to teach evil. So not off to a great start when it came to academic freedom and protections of the First Amendment. And it didn't get much better in the 50s when we were going through the period of the Red Scare and McCarthyism. During that period, anyone accused of any kind of leftist views had to watch out. And one of the primary tools being used by institutions around the country was the loyalty oath. In fact, in 1950, California adopted a loyalty oath requirement, and the State Board of Regents dismissed 31 professors because they refused to sign it. They challenged that and were later reinstated. But the Supreme Court didn't look at loyalty oaths until really the late 50s through the early 1970s with somewhat mixed results. Free speech issues for students came to campus in the 1960s, most notably beginning with the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1964. And the issue there was that students wanted the right and the ability, without being impeded by the university, to be able to talk about the political issues of the day on campus. Now, this was the 60s, so there were a great number of political issues to talk about, starting with the civil rights movement. Every day, we were confronted with new outrages for people being denied civil rights and denied the ability to speak about it in their struggles. And two of the important lessons we learned from this era and the cases that ultimately went to the Supreme Court were that governments could not use local ordinances like disturbing the peace to quell peaceful demonstrations. And secondly, that the First Amendment prohibits the application of what is called the Hecklers Veto. That is, crowds do not get to denounce and hound people away from speaking, and that it is the government's obligation to protect the speaker rather than to allow the unruly mob to silence the speaker. This was also the time of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And so we see the clashes up here in the Chicago Convention in 1968, the Democratic National Convention. We see peaceful protesters being met with bayonets, and of course the tragic, iconic photograph from Kent State in 1971 after 4 students were killed by Ohio National Guard while they were in the midst of an anti-war demonstration. Not all protests were violent or raucous. This is Mary Beth Tinker and her brothers who won the right to wear black armbands to school in protest of the Vietnam War. Actually, they were armbands in mourning for the people who were killed on both sides of the war. The landmark 1969 decision basically reaffirmed that neither students nor teachers shed their constitutional rights to free expression at the schoolhouse gate. That same year was the year of the Stonewall Rebellion, or the Stonewall Riots, which marked the beginning of the gay rights movement in America. I've always been a little struck. Did you notice in the free speech movement photo, you had people in Berkeley coming to a demonstration wearing suits? It kind of looked like a Blues Brothers convention. It always struck me that the cops in the background here look like they're actually members of the Village People. But anyway, this was the beginning of the gay rights movement. And the same was true of the women's movement around the same period, where you have people turning out in the streets and relying on these same principles that were affirmed by courts during the civil rights era. Now, of course, not everybody who was protected by these laws we would describe as progressives. As a matter of fact, in the late 1970s, in 1977 to be exact, the American Nazi Party sought a parade permit to march in Skokie, Illinois, which was the home to many Holocaust survivors. It was an abhorrent idea. The ACLU, to its credit, defended the right of the speakers, and in a landmark decision that cost the ACLU many supporters, affirmed the principle that the First Amendment is neutral politically, that it protects firebrand priests and Vatican critics alike. It defends people who advocate either for a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy or against it. It protects anti-war demonstrators as well as people who would support the government's position in a war. And we see these same issues really recurring today. The issues have not changed, from the protests for Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matter to the tumult of our current political dialogue, if you can call it a dialogue. And then, of course, the tragic events of Charlottesville, where you have the unremitting ugliness of seeing tiki torch parades and violence in the streets, and again, as in Kent State, resulting in a tragic death. Of course, the events of what's happening in free speech around the country applies equally to what's going on campus, so we see violent reactions to certain speakers coming to campus, in this case, alt-right speakers. We see the reactions of students polarizing as well, some arguing that speech that is uncomfortable or offensive or that marginalizes certain groups should be banned, where other students will support a more robust notion of protecting speech regardless of the consequences. we see demands for safe spaces. This, of course, is adjunct professor Melissa Click asking for some muscle to oust a student photographer from what she called a safe space. We also see this in demands for trigger warnings, although, of course, the concept of trigger warnings, as I think we'll hear, means many different things to many people. When I used to teach courses on FCC law and the George Carlin 7 Dirty Words, I would often tell students at the beginning of the semester, you know, here's a trigger warning. If you really are bothered by harsh language, now is the perfect time to get the fuck out of here. So trigger warnings are there as well. There. We also have free speech zones, as JP was talking about. Free speech zones being places relegated by administrative decree on certain campuses that limit the expression of student views to certain limited areas of campus. That has become an issue in litigation around the country. And we also see demands to oust certain speakers, deny them a platform on campus because either the speakers or their ideas are considered to be too hateful. Now, all of this is governed by First Amendment law, but more importantly, and for purposes of tonight's discussion, it also is a question of not what the law is, but what it is the law, what you want it to be. And here's where I think a quote from Judge Learned Hand from 1944 really touches on that point, because it's not a question of what the law protects, but what the collective, what the public wants it to protect, and whether or not it's protected in the hearts and minds of the citizens. So with that, we're going to explore these issues as they apply to campuses today. And let me start, Noam, with you, and let me just ask, how would you assess the current state of freedom of speech on American campuses, and what would you identify as the biggest problems?
Okay, simple question. I think it's in many ways problematic, in ways that it's important to consider carefully and to think about in the light of our experience and history generally. These issues will be discussed in the period that follows. Sigal and Nadine have both written important books about it, and there have been others. The indication that there's a problem of free speech on campus is given by polls of students, which show that considerable majority, sometimes close to 3/4, believe that hateful ideas have no place on campus. Racist, sexist, xenophobic, and so on. And I think that is a problem. It's a problem because though the motives are understandable, admirable in many ways, and can be accommodated appropriately, I think, nevertheless, the principle is mistaken. I'm sure we'll have ample discussion of that. And it's also a tactical error for quite a number of reasons. One of them you've just seen. If you look at the history of such concepts, which is rich and ugly, such principles have almost invariably been directed against vulnerable groups, groups that deviate from what George Orwell once called the pervasive orthodoxy, and have been efforts to sustain power, authority, and domination. That goes right till the present, in fact, and we can anticipate that if such principles are established and in a firm fashion, that'll continue to be the way they're used. And there's another reason why it's tactically mistaken. If you have a festering sore, the cure is not to irritate it, but to find out what its roots, where it comes from, and to deal with those. Racist and other such speech is a festering sore. By silencing it, You simply amplify its appeal and even lend it a veneer of respectability, as in fact we've seen very clearly in the last couple of years. And what has to be done, plainly, is to confront it and to ask where it comes from and to try to deal with the roots of such ideas. That's the way to extirpate the ugliness and evil that lies behind such phenomena. And as we think about this, I'd suggest reflecting a little on something that's really not the topic tonight, but nevertheless is worth keeping in the back of your mind. When we ask about the state of free speech on campus today, we should be asking ourselves, in comparison to what? Well, the natural comparison is to the period when student activism in the modern period really began to take off. Some of the pictures that you saw, the 1960s. So what was the situation like on campus at that time? Well, one of the major recent books on free speech on campus, actually the book that had the lead review in the New York Times Book Review last Sunday, is called The Coddling of the American Mind. And it discusses the danger of safe spaces, other devices, which are leading, it claims, with some justification, to citizenry which is unwilling to face alternative ideas and stays within its own cocoon, and that's destructive of the people, of course, destructive of democracy. I think there's a fair amount of validity to that, and we can ask what it was like in the 1960s. Well, when the student movements began to develop, what they were opposing was safe spaces, namely the university system and the intellectual culture, which was a safe space for the prevailing orthodoxy, with remarkable effectiveness, as Orwell wrote, speaking of England. That's what the university and the culture was like. And minds were indeed coddled. They were protected from what were regarded as dangerous ideas. Actually, you saw an example of that in the comments about Russell. It happened to be a little bit earlier, but that was very much the case in the academic environment and, in fact, the intellectual culture generally in the 1950s and early 60s. And that's why when you look at what the student movement was doing, it was not only engaged in important tasks of trying to gain the right of free speech on campus, but in discipline after discipline, students were creating alternatives. The major issue in the 60s, one of the major issues was the Vietnam War. The Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars, initiated by students, it's flourished since, still alive, was a critique of the prevailing orthodoxy in political science and Asian studies department, which was extremely rigid. Same happened in economics and political science and history and so on. The Union of Concerned Scientists was critiquing the unwillingness of the scientific community to confront seriously the effects of the use of the technology and scientific ideas that they were developing. This was prevalent throughout. And if you look back at the orthodoxy of the 60s, you can understand why. We may have forgotten, but it's worth remembering. So, for example, in the 1960s, the leading study of American diplomatic history by a distinguished liberal scholar blandly described the task of the colonists once they had attained independence. Their task, he said, was to turn to the job of felling trees and Indians and expanding to the national borders. That's pervasive orthodoxy, felling trees and Indians and expanding to the national borders. Not a hint of protest. Actually, if you look up the phrase on Google, you'll find the nature of the protest. A couple of dozen quotes from things of mine and nothing else, because no one saw anything wrong with it. Today, I think it would be inconceivable that you could have a statement like that almost anywhere, but certainly not in the leading, most prestigious history of American diplomacy. And it continues. The leading anthropologists in the country were telling us that the Indian population was a group of scattered savages dedicated to vicious warfare, no culture, nothing. In the Cold War, which was, of course, raging at the time, the sole idea that could be expressed was what's called the Orthodox Position. The United States is absolute sublimity. Our enemy is ultimate evil. Nothing further to discuss. If you think about, and this conveyed, it not only coddled the minds of students, but coddled the general population. So you look at attitudes at the time, about 5% of the population thought that interracial marriages were tolerable. 50 years later, it's about 90%. And a large reason for that is the impact of student activism. You have to recall that in the 1960s, the United States still had anti-miscegenation laws so severe that when the Nazis in the 1930s were looking for models, these were the only ones they could find, but they were too harsh, so the Nazis wouldn't accept them, because U.S. had the one drop of blood principle. That was too much for the Nazis. Same on issue after issue. It's something that one should definitely bear in mind. So yes, the academic culture, the intellectual culture were safe spaces. They were coddling the American mind, and the student activism has played an enormous role in the vanguard of demolishing much of this. There's plenty to be done still. We can say not this extreme, but similar things today, and that should be recognized. In fact, it's happened right here in Tucson, as many of you know better than I do. There was an effort by the legislature to kill a very effective Mexican-American studies program in the schools. It was confronted by students, high school students, who demonstrated, protested, effectively. They didn't manage to ban the law, but they did help create a mentality which led the federal judge to impose an injunction so that it can't be applied. These are very important things to keep in mind, I think, in the background when we talk about the problems of campus, of free speech on campus today, which are very significant ones.
Thank you, Noam. Nadine, you want to take a crack at that too?
Yeah, well, Bob, you alluded to probably the most famous or infamous ACLU case in our almost 100-year history, the so-called Skokie case, where an organization which has been in the vanguard of civil rights and civil liberties and striving for equality and against hatred and discrimination, how could we come to the defense of the free speech rights of Nazis who had the polar opposite view? And interestingly enough, that position, although it was a slam dunk winner in the courts of law, because the legal principle that was at stake is what the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle of freedom of speech, that government may not discriminate against any idea or viewpoint, no matter how hateful or hated it is. If we disagree with it, we can ignore it, we can refute it, we can demonstrate against it, but we should not allow government to silence it. So it was completely uncontroversial in the courts of law, all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. But in the court of public opinion, it was so controversial, even among card-carrying ACLU members, right? Diehard free speech supporters. As you alluded to, we lost 15% of our members. So when I hear that today's college students are so intolerant of free speech in unprecedented numbers, I have to laugh and say, this is always true throughout my entire adult lifetime, and I think it's sort of a human nature. If somebody is, and common sense, right? If somebody is saying something evil, what's the harm from suppressing that evil message? The harm is exactly what Noam talked about, that you have to look beyond the particular message to the underlying principle, and you have to make people understand that if the principle is that a hated message in a particular community can be stifled just because it is hated, then no speech is safe. And particularly endangered is any speech, as Noam indicated, that challenges the status quo, that advocates for law reform and justice. So in the Nazi case in 1977, the arguments were made that their ideas are hated and they're dangerous and they're subversive. And the ACLU pointed out in our brief that that was exactly the same argument that was made just a few years earlier, also in Illinois, in a town called Cicero, Illinois, which was highly segregated. And when Martin Luther King tried to have a pro-civil rights demonstration there, the people in Cicero made exactly the same arguments that were made by the people in Skokie, because in Cicero, it was the pro-civil rights message that was seen as subversive and dangerous. So I think forums like this are so important because it gives us an opportunity to get beyond the sound bites, right? We're not defending free speech for Nazis. We're defending freedom of speech so that anti-Nazis can exercise it as well.
So that we all can. Sigal?
So I have to agree with what you're saying, Nadine, and also Noam, but I actually think that the way that we apply these principles of neutrality and the strong support that we should have democratically for free speech, we have to apply it appropriately to the different institutions that we are addressing. And when we are thinking about colleges and universities, we have to think about them not as any other old part of the democratic system. We have to think about them as institutions that are serving a particular mission. And the mission that universities and colleges serve is the search for knowledge or truth, as people sometimes prefer to think about it. The search for knowledge and truth, which calls for a greater tolerance for a great diversity of ideas and opinions. And also, we have the mission of educating students, and this mission sometimes indicates that we need to rethink some of our basic principles in the way that they apply to our campuses. So we need to think about the unequal burden that the open expression can create for many of our students. And that doesn't mean that we need to censor speech or that we need to set up a committee that will say, you cannot say that and you can say that, but that we need to be more sensitive to the impact of words in an educational context, right? You asked, Bob, what is the state of free speech on college campuses today? I actually think that universities and colleges, the 4,000 or so institutions around this country that are part of the higher education sector, They are one of the greatest defenders of the First Amendment today. I think that they are one of the greatest places where First Amendment is actually protected and where free speech is practiced every day. What do we do here all day long? We only just talk. I mean, I think ideas and opinions are negotiated as just the daily course of action, way more than they do in many of the other institutions in this country, whether it's social media, whether it's private businesses, whether it's even some of the institutions of government. So I think the higher education sector is not perfect. We have various things to work on. We're not always supporting diversity of opinions. We sometimes overreact as students or as professors or scientists, etc., and we suppress speech. So there is a lot to work on, but I actually think that as a sector, we are doing a pretty good job supporting and protecting the open expression of ideas. And I just will, so that I don't sound so rosy, I will note that, Bob, in your presentation, you mentioned the Tinker case and how students and teachers in high schools or in public schools don't shed their freedoms at the school's door. My main concern for colleges and universities is that students today come to campus from public schools in the United States that for 40 years have been limiting the Tinker decision. For 40 years now, there are more and more forms of expression for young people, especially middle and high school students, more and more forms of expression that are not permitted, and more leeway that the courts are giving to schools, to teachers and administrators to silence high school student speech, if it's disruptive to the learning environment, if there is sexual innuendo, if there is some reference to drugs. There are all sorts of reasons to limit high school student speech. And so when these same young people come to campus, they have never practiced, they have never experienced an atmosphere of open expression in their daily life, in their institutions that they study at. So this is something that is of greater concern to me in the area of open expression than, you know, the various things that we clearly need to work on our campuses.
You know, and yet going back to that wonderful statement from Learned Hand that speech is going to, I'm not sure you didn't have that one in your slides, I think. So
No, different
quote. One. But
yeah.
Let me say this, it was a famous speech given in 1941 during World War II called The Spirit of Liberty, in which he said, the spirit of liberty lives in the hearts and minds
Actually, it was the same.
of men and women. If it lives there, then it needs no court, no constitution, no law to save it. If it dies there, no constitution, no court, no law can save it. And what has been so inspiring on the high school front, because I totally agree with Sigal that the law has moved in a terrible direction, but look at the student activism that we had against guns, and pro-gun regulation, even from much younger students. And that to me is, free speech is alive and well, even at that age too.
Yeah, but I think you put your finger on something in talking about the really wide divergence between the First Amendment protections for university students versus the protections for secondary school students. And in many ways, the Tinker decision in 1969 was the high point for the protection of student free expression at that point, and it's been cut back since then. So the divergence between what students have been used to by the time they get to college is pretty wide. And I think that speaks to the point that you raised at the outset of your comments, that the university is a special environment, and yet you have a population of people who are expected to have and understand full First Amendment rights. But it requires the universities to be involved in a balancing act between creating an inclusive environment in which marginalized groups are considered to be accepted, and at the same time, protecting and preserving full First Amendment protections. How can universities perform that balancing act without tipping too far in one direction or the other? Sure.
Or go ahead, you should start.
I think there has to be a mixture of devices. We have to understand and recognize that a university has multiple dimensions. It is a domain in which research and inquiry should be carried out without external constraints, with a willingness to challenge received ideas, to confront prevailing orthodoxy. Almost all of the great discoveries of the past have been made by people who overturned firmly held beliefs, passionately held beliefs, often facing enormous difficulties, to the extent of being burned at the stake if you go back far enough, but finally breaking through. Universities should be a domain like that. On the other hand, it's also true that a university is somewhere between a public place and a person's home. So, for example, I think everyone would agree that no one has a right to come into my living room and post a sign saying, "Kill the Jews," right? Or even in my office, or even on the door of my office, which is a public space. And for students, the university is in part their home, and they have a right to have their concerns, their susceptibility to insult and denigration they should have a right to be protected from that. So there has to be a mixture, and I think the right mixture is to allow to ensure that there is freedom of inquiry, that there's openness to anyone being invited. If they have hateful views, confront the views, and more seriously, look into their roots. We want to eliminate them, to extirpate them at the roots, not just to put them off and say, I don't want to hear them. And at the same time, I think it does make sense to allow things like safe spaces, to permit students to have the right to avoid being confronted with things that they feel are harmful and denigrating, and to generally create an atmosphere of free interaction and discussion, which will lead to the understanding that the way to confront things that are hateful and injurious is to deal with them, not to escape from them. It doesn't help you to escape from them. It helps you to confront them and find out where they're coming from and go after the sources of where they're coming from. That, I think, is what a proper learning experience is. And it requires, I don't think there's a single formula that you can use to say, here's what we do all the time. Cases have to be dealt with on the basis of existing circumstances, with sympathy and understanding, but in the background, holding firm to principles that I think are valid and significant.
So the way a lot of universities have started dealing with this matter in the past couple of years has been adopting principles like the Chicago principles, which are basically a set of statements that affirm the commitment to open expression and the refusal to or an insistence on maintaining an open environment for research and free inquiry, just as Noam was describing just now. I think principles like these are, of course, very important, but they are insufficient because they refuse to recognize the justified expectations that students have that we fulfill the implied promise that we made when we admitted them to college, right? That they are actually welcomed members here. That when we create an environment of open expression, we don't just mean that we are defending all ideas. We also mean, especially in an educational environment, that we ensure that all people can actually participate in the conversation, right? So that it's not just the ideas that are protected, but also the individuals who are looking to participate in the process of their own education and their own training or whatever it is that they came to do at the university. And so I think the students, you mentioned, Noam, some of the polls that are coming also, and Trevor mentioned that polls coming about, or surveys about students, whether they are supportive of or unsupportive of the First Amendment or open expression policies. I think students are saying something very important, right? They are saying, when I come to my semi-home, right, as the university is serving me for a few years, I'm looking for an assurance that my contributions are going to be recognized as any other person's contributions. It doesn't mean that I'm always right or that everybody's going to agree with me, but it means that I'm not going to be denigrated, that my dignity is not going to be undermined, and that I'm not going to be silenced because of a group I belong to, as in your example, because of my identity, or because of some assumptions that people make about me. So my sense is that the balancing act has to be rooted in a commitment to the dual purpose of the university, the search for knowledge and the educational mission of the university, which requires creating not a safe space in the intellectual sense that you rightly just now criticized, Noam, in your previous answer, but a safe space in the sense of in the sense that we provide all of our students that they are welcome and valued members of our community of free inquiry.
I totally agree with everything that's been said, and if I could summarize and recapitulate, it's that we should celebrate and encourage and provide a safe space for diversity, inclusivity, equality, and dignity for all ideas and also for all people. And the reason I wrote my book is I saw that too many students and other people seem to feel that there's an inherent tension between the equality, diversity, inclusivity, societal harmony for people versus free speech. And based on my own experience and based on studying what's happened around the world under laws that do censor hate speech, I am completely convinced that liberty for freedom of speech and equality and dignity for all people are ultimately mutually reinforcing. That the best and most effective possible way to advance equality and dignity is through free speech, in addition to, of course, outlawing actual discrimination. And by the way, Noam referred to this, we have not come as far as we need to on that basis. I mean, in this country, at the federal level, it is still completely lawful to refuse to hire somebody or to fire somebody because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So, I mean, clearly we have not done enough to outlaw actual discriminatory conduct, and we have to vigorously enforce laws against discriminatory violence, which also occurs too much, the so-called hate crimes or bias crimes. But in terms of responding to hateful ideas. I've heard it here from both of my colleagues. We have to educate and empower all of our students, including, perhaps especially, those who are members of groups that are subject to disparagement. And I do not at all mean that they should have a special burden to respond to hate speech. All of us have that moral responsibility. I think especially those of us who oppose censorship should be the first ones to be on the front lines to raise our voices against any kind of hateful, discriminatory expression. And we are seeing, but we have to empower those who are subject to disparagement, give them the education and the resources and the resiliency and the access to communications technology to amplify their voices. And that is a point that was made over and over again, for example, by President Obama, including his last couple of commencement speeches. One of them was at Howard University, of course, a historically black institution. And he said, look, I know it puts a burden on minority students to do it, to go face to face with those who are disparaging them, but you want to make deep-seated changes in society, right? That's what the Black Lives Matter movement is about. And the only way you're going to do it is the way the civil rights demonstrators in the 60s did it, which is confronting those who tried to bring you down and not allowing them to do it. And there are ways that educators and psychologists can empower everybody to be an effective advocate and to be resilient, and rather than allowing somebody to demean you, they are the ones who are demeaned by those ideas. And let me just say one other thing, because I think it's not only a matter of trying to refute hate mongers. I actually have a lot of hope, based on research I did for my book, that we should not give up hope for them too. There are such inspiring stories, even of people who have been leaders of hate organizations. When people reach out to them with compassion and with empathy for them as human beings, of course, condemning their ideas, but not treating them as criminals, not giving up on them, right? We believe in restorative justice. I do, even for people who have committed murder. So why not for somebody who has, committed a hate crime or a hate speech act? And I have hope based on actual experience. There's an organization called Life After Hate, which was founded by people who were the heads of violent hate-monger organizations who came to see the error of their ways and are now working full-time to recruit others away from those organizations.
I just want to make a really quick response. You say that educators and psychologists can assist people in being more resilient and more effective in confronting disparaging comments or racist or other biased views about them. And my view about this, that it, in a way, it trusts educators and psychologists a little bit too much and demands a little bit too much of them. And I'm a big supporter of teachers and psychologists. I like, all of these professions, but I don't think we should relegate this responsibility to the domain of somebody else. So we need a systemic approach that recognizes the responsibility of the university to address the challenges that are being raised.
And that's the point I was getting to. And let me probe that a little bit further, because I think you've all very well articulated the fact that there is a balance that has to be addressed. Noam, I particularly take your point that universities are special places in that they are also residences. But you would have different rules for inside a dorm room or inside a classroom as you would for the vast open spaces of a university. They're more like a public forum. And the question then is, what are you defining, or how do you define what is a safe space? Because, does that mean that's a space in the open spaces of the university where you prevent anyone from saying anything that could be considered derogatory? and that is where we confront that potential conflict between equality and liberty. How do you perform that dual role of trying to serve both values without restricting what people have to say, what some people would call hate speech, although it's a term that is undefined, or it means something different to everyone who uses it. Not whether their balance is there to be struck, other than through more speech or education, but how do you strike that balance as an institution?
Well, as I said, I don't think there's a rigid formula. We have to ask, under what circumstances do we act one way or another? So we're all committed to the principle of freedom of speech. Do we agree that a neo-Nazi group can put up in Times Square, New York, a big advertisement saying, "Kill all the Jews"? I don't think there's a simple formula that answers that question. You have to consider lots of factors. And I think those questions arise in case after case within the university. I think it should be a principle. I don't think we can really find absolute principles, but there are some principles that you need quite a burden of proof to overcome them. One of those principles is that any speaker on any topic should be permitted on campus. I think that's the right principle. It's also, I think, tactically right. Again, I'll use the same image I used before. If you have a festering sore, you don't deal with it by saying, "I'm not going to look at it," and you don't deal with it by irritating it so it gets worse. You deal with it by treating it and asking where it came from and dealing with the roots. And that's the way you deal with hateful ideas. If someone wants to put up a sign saying, "Kill the Jews," ask where that's coming from and why anybody is even listening to it, and deal with that. Not look away and say, "I don't want to see it," and don't allow it to be said, which again gives it a veneer of respectability. And I think there are general principles. They are not absolute, but they are worth holding with real fervor and commitment, and recognizing at the same time that there may be circumstances in which modifications are necessary in order to deal with legitimate sensitivities and concerns.
Can I make a suggestion of some places on campus that could be, and in my view, as an academic and as a civil rights, human rights advocate, should be safe spaces? One, Noam already alluded to, and that is in residential areas or quasi-residential, so it would be dormitories for students or for faculty members, their offices. I think that is analogous to the home, and it should not be a free-for-all for people to come in and express their views in a place where you have a right to demand sanctuary.
Or the library.
Another example would be the classroom, where we as professors have a responsibility to create a certain environment that is maximally conducive to education. I think it's completely appropriate to do what I do in my law school classes, which is to, and Trevor can attest to it because he's a graduate of a couple of my law school classes, to say for purposes of your professional training, as well as for equal respect and equal opportunity for participation, I'm only going to allow you to use the kind of language that would be appropriate in an argument before the United States Supreme Court. Although seeing all the rumpus that's going on in Congress lately, who knows, maybe I'm going to have a higher standard than that. And also, etymologically, the term safe space first came into use, I would say, in around the 70s or 80s, when we first, shockingly recently by my standards, started to see a major influx into colleges of women and members of racial minorities who traditionally had either been wholly excluded or very marginalized, and they would be sometimes admitted in very small numbers and feel very isolated and alienated. And I think it was very positive that universities would create a certain hall or a building or area where African American students or women or other people who were minorities could feel safe relating to people with whom they shared a certain background. Ironically, the University of Chicago, despite its vaunted free speech principles and the letter, which I support, by the way, and the letter that was sent out by some official there saying, we don't have any safe spaces, the University of Chicago does have that kind of safe space, including for LGBT students. And I don't think it should not be a preserve where certain ideas are off limits, but it's more an affirmative idea to create a special welcoming environment for students who would be in particular need of that.
So I think you're making, Nadine, some really important distinctions between different spaces within the university. The university is not just one structure, right? The classroom, I don't permit protests in my classroom, right? If people don't like my syllabus, well, they may not take the class, but if they have to take the class, they can come and speak to me. We did see protests inside classrooms in some colleges, and I think that's not the right space to do that, right? So we can differentiate between different places that are safe or where different kinds of speech is appropriate, and other places where safety and dignity and affirmation should be prioritized. But I still don't think that any kind of speech, as was suggested, I think, by both of you, generally speaking, that any speaker should be permitted at the university. I think universities, again, they are not the marketplace of ideas. They are trying to promote a particular mission. For example, they prioritize what they see as at least not going beyond the boundaries of accepted knowledge. For instance, I think it's completely permissible for the geography department at my university not to invite, to decide on principle not to invite a speaker from the Flat Earth Society. I think it's fine. I think this goes beyond what we see as acceptable scientific knowledge, and so the Flat Earth Society is not represented in our conference about whatever it might be. And I don't know anything about geography, so it was just an example.
So for all you know, the Flat Earth Society could be right.
Maybe I would actually support them.
But
right?
let me pick up on that.
So I think it's important to recognize that as institutions, we elevate and we value certain types of speech. Now, obviously, we make mistakes, and obviously, there's going to be internal negotiations about what's appropriate. And obviously, as we all agreed, that's why I'm saying obviously, right? Because the people up here have agreed that this is that we need to have very broad boundaries for the kind of speech that we accept. But we already don't accept every kind of speech. If I want to go into my classroom, my philosophy classroom, and read poetry, it's protected speech, but it's not appropriate for my professional role, right? So we anyway regulate which types of speech are appropriate, and I think that makes sense for us.
But aren't we talking about different things here, though? We're talking about the difference between academic standards, which talk about whether or not someone is competently performing in their discipline, versus whether or not someone is legally protected in being able to express an idea, even a hateful idea or a minority idea. And so I guess the question comes down to whether or not the university as a specialized location is covered by the same First Amendment as the rest of society, or a different First Amendment, more like what students in secondary education have, which is a minimalist, less protective version of the First Amendment.
And
well, in my view, it's neither. right? Because I think, of course, it's protected by the broader requirements of the First Amendment, not the more limited one, which are meant to defend the people who are minors. I mean, it has, the school is seen as serving, people who are not yet citizens, right? The courts are not recognizing people under 18. They are seeing them more as citizens in training, and so their freedom or liberty to express their views is seen as having to wait until they grow up and are able to express ideas more effectively, which is the justification for prioritizing the learning environment over the students expressing their own views. Their views don't matter yet by this standard. I don't accept that, right? But by these standards, their views are not formed yet, and so it's fine to limit their expression. I clearly don't think that this is the case about university students, right? I think we do need to provide a robust context in which students should actually be more free to express their views than we currently permit, and definitely more free than what some current state legislatures are promoting, limitations on student protests, etc. I don't think that's justified by the university's mission or by some view that we may have about students. So I think it's really the university's commitment to make sure that it's protecting the rights and the liberties of all students to participate, which sometimes might mean, if not censoring, then at least limiting the reach of biased views and hate-based views.
Who decides that?
This is, so definitely not my committee, let me tell you. I don't think we need to have a censorship committee that is going to sit and, sort through ideas and decide. We already have a lot of avenues at the university, peer reviews, departmental meetings, so decisions that permit certain speakers or that prioritize certain speakers over others, that prefer certain forms of expression over others. I think the disciplines are providing us with some opportunity to vet speech according to the university's mission. I think shared governance, which I know is in decline, and I lament that, but shared governance, including with participation from students, is another avenue that permits us to try and understand what are the concerns that students are raising. Maybe some of them are exaggerated. They are young people. I mean, maybe there is something they can learn about the First Amendment. I have a lot to learn too as well. So I think a shared process of decision-making about what is appropriate, I don't think is beyond the pale for an educational institution that is trying to promote its own mission, right? I don't think it's the same, even at a public university that's more restricted by the First Amendment, of course. Even at a public university, I don't think it undermines the goal of government shall make no law, and I don't think it undermines the goal of maintaining a broad basis of conversation.
Well, again, we're kind of mixing together different aspects of the university. So every university, to the best of my knowledge, has some public areas which are essentially like public parks, and they're literally open to the general public, even beyond the university community. There, it's like the traditional Hyde Park corner in London, right? Anybody who has the physical space can stand on a soapbox and say anything he or she wants. But in other contexts, who's going to be invited to give a titled lecture, who's going to give a commencement address, who's going to be a guest speaker in class, who's going to be part of a lecture, who's going to be invited to a wonderful program like this. Obviously, you have to make selective judgments, and of course, one of the factors that you take into account are the person's ideas. That said, I would resist deciding to exclude somebody solely because the ideas are controversial and hated by some people or seen as hateful by some people. Let me give a good example. The President of the United States, I think his ideas are hateful. Many of his ideas are hateful. It's a position the ACLU has taken in many lawsuits against the Trump administration, a record number. But I still think there would be educational value in bringing him to a university campus where Noam could interrogate him. And
She would like you to interview Trump, the president, about his ideas.
We're all looking forward to that
the next
day.
program, next year.
Let me ask each of you if you could recommend one thing or two things that you think universities should do to protect and preserve freedom of expression on campus. What would that be?
What should universities do to defend freedom of expression
If you
on
could make
campus?
one recommendation.
How to,
Yeah.
how to defend it on
How do we
campus?
defend it? By defending it. That is, I don't, maybe I'm simple-minded, but I think if a group of students decides they want to hear a speaker who, in my view, is utterly hateful and destructive, I think they have a right to do it. I can give examples. For example, I'll say something totally outrageous, okay, but I think true. If you take the people who are in positions of power in the United States, in the political system, in the financial system, in the general economic system, I think that things that they are doing now rank as the most evil in human history, literally. Just think about it for a second. Anybody who's not living under a rock knows that we're undergoing a process of global warming, which within a short period of time, maybe by the end of this century, if conditions continue the way they are, will lead to basically making organized human life virtually impossible. Imagine living in a world where the sea level has risen, say, 20 feet. Just think about what that would mean. The big banks in the United States, J.P. Morgan, Chase, Jamie Dimon, and others, are rapidly increasing their investments in fossil fuels. That is, they are trying to accelerate this process. In the political system, the leadership, which is perfectly cognizant of everything I just said, we can show that by their actions in other cases, are making decisions which will lead to this outcome. If you can think of anything comparable to that in human history, I would like to hear it. Nevertheless, if a student group decides to invite Jamie Dimon or Rex Tillerson or Donald Trump, I wouldn't say that that has to be blocked. I would say, let's hear what they have to say, let's confront it, let's refute it, let's find the sources from which it's coming, and try to deal with them before it destroys all of us. And I think this principle holds in case after case.
Maybe I'll say a word and you get the last word.
What recommendations would you make, Sigal?
I mean, I would agree completely with what Noam just now said. I think universities must not censor or limit student organizations and student groups, and they should have not only just the permission to invite whichever speakers they are interested in hearing, but also the equal support. If the university is supporting student organizations, it has to do that in a neutral way and without choosing according to the content of the ideas of the speakers. But I would also say that the university should at the same time take the initiative to expand some of the ideas that are present on campus if it sees that these ideas are skewed or that there are some visions or some groups or some members of campus that are not being effectively heard. The university can and it does organize events on its own. It's not, I mean, you mentioned commencement, which is, of course, one of these special events. But there are other events like this one and much smaller ones where you can support more ideas to be heard. If you see that the university is prioritizing, that student organizations are prioritizing a certain set of ideas, you can then sponsor and support other visions and other perspectives. So I think you especially have the responsibility to do that when the ideas that are being raised are contradictory to the mission that you are trying to advance, and maybe even contradictory to the values that the university is trying to hold. If there are going to be biased or hate-based speakers, I don't think we need to, as a university, as a committee, or as an administration, to chase them out or to prevent them from coming. Definitely not. But I do think we need to then counterbalance their views by supporting a speaker series or an event or other context in which contradicting ideas will be voiced and heard in an effective way through the support of the university.
And I would go one step further, and I
If
think...
I understand correctly, there is agreement that, say, if a group of students wants to bring a speaker who most of us think have obnoxious ideas, they should be permitted to do it. If there are voices in the university that are suppressed, the suppression should be overcome. Their right to confront the speaker should be facilitated. However, there's a difference between the university facilitating and supporting alternatives and the university taking a position. I don't think it's right for the university to take a position. If we do that, we'll be back to what happened to Bertrand Russell.
Yes.
Yeah,
Nadine will give you the last word.
Oh, no, that's such a big responsibility. Well, you asked for concrete suggestions for promoting freedom of speech, and I think this forum and the whole series, thanks to the generous donors and thanks to your star professor here, Noam Chomsky, is really epitomizes what I think is so important, and that is education about freedom of speech principles, especially because they're not taught anymore in high schools, right? We're not even taught a lot of what used to be called civics about the Constitution, and to the contrary, we don't learn how to exercise those rights. So I think universities have a special responsibility, starting with orientation. And I understand a lot of orientation programs, if not all of them, teach us about diversity in the important senses of respect for the dignity and equality and voices of all of us, given our different backgrounds. And that should also extend to diversity of ideas. And it should also be not only an abstract indoctrination into, or introduction to the principles of freedom of speech and why they're so important. Historically, the crucial social justice advocacy that was suppressed before we had robust freedom of speech. But we have to create opportunities for students to actually exercise their own free speech rights. We have to do that as teachers in our classrooms, and we have to do it through co-curricular activities, and we have to do it by encouraging you, whatever your views are, to remember what I consider to be the most important right of all, and that is the right not to remain silent.
Let me just follow up with one last question on that, and that is the civics education that you talk about, which I agree is badly needed and is essential. Is it also necessary to educate students that the right to exercise their free speech and their obligation to exercise their free speech rights also entails the obligation not to disrupt other speakers?
Absolutely, and I think a very concrete step that universities could take, but I didn't realize I have time to make that point, is to enforce disciplinary rules when students or others violate other people's free speech rights through violence or through disruptive protest. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely defend the right to vigorous protest, and that would mean, silently protesting. In my view, that even means, vocally voicing objections to speakers, but not for such a sustained period that you interfere with the right of the speaker to try to convey a message and the right of willing audience members to hear that message. But we've seen too many instances on college campuses where actual violence and physical injury and assault and classroom demonstrations, as Sigal mentioned, have gone unpunished, and that creates a disincentive to others to refrain from violating free speech rights, and it is escalating security costs on many campuses, which at some point they're not going to be able to afford those costs, and then free speech will really be in jeopardy.
Thank you. And let me thank all the panelists, and JP will see us home.
Thank all of you very much. Thank you again, Don, very much. Thanks to all the panelists. Thank you for all coming so far. It was right in the middle of the week, and I know that you had to push aside some students yourselves to be here, and I really appreciate it. I've read both of these books. They're fantastic books. They're also different in the topics that they address and in the conclusions. And as I like to say, they are available at better bookstores, as well as outside here if you are at all interested. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank the audience.